Tonight's stories all begin the same way: an ordinary phone call, a request for help, a voice asking someone to send police. But in every case tonight, something goes horribly wrong before help can arrive. Some of these calls became evidence in murder investigations. Some were released years later through public records requests, and others are still debated online because nobody fully understands what was happening in the background. These are some of the most disturbing 911 calls people still talk about years later. Welcome back to Dead Air. On the night of August 8th, 2013, Brandon Lawson was driving through rural Texas after an argument with his girlfriend. At around midnight, Brandon called his father and told him he was heading toward his brother's house in the nearby town of Crowley. But sometime during the drive, something changed. Around 12:50 a.m., Brandon placed a frantic call to 911 from the side of Highway 277 near Bronte, Texas. The audio is infamous online because it's incredibly difficult to understand. Brandon sounds terrified, out of breath, at times almost incoherent. Dispatchers believed he said, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field," and later, "We're not talking to them." Internet investigators would spend years trying to clean up the recording, isolate the audio, and figure out what he actually meant. Some people believed Brandon had witnessed a crime. Others thought someone was chasing him. Some theorized he was hallucinating due to drugs or sleep deprivation. But regardless of what was happening, one thing is clear in the recording: Brandon genuinely sounded afraid. A few minutes after the 911 call, Brandon contacted his brother Kyle and told him his truck had run out of gas. Kyle drove out to help him. When he arrived, he found Brandon's truck parked on the side of the road with the doors unlocked. The engine was still running, but Brandon was nowhere in sight. Kyle reportedly shouted for him into the darkness surrounding the highway, but only heard movement somewhere in the fields nearby. Then, silence. Police initially assumed Brandon had simply wandered off. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into years, the case became one of the internet's most heavily analyzed disappearances. People obsessed over every detail of the call. Some listeners claimed they could hear multiple voices in the background. Others became convinced Brandon was hiding from someone. One especially disturbing detail is that Brandon's final known movements all happened within minutes. The 911 call, the call to his brother, the abandoned truck, and then nothing. No confirmed sightings, no additional phone activity, no explanation. For nearly a decade, the mystery remained unsolved, and the audio itself became part of internet folklore. Because unlike many emergency calls, this one doesn't contain screaming or obvious violence. It's disturbing because it feels incomplete, like listeners are hearing only one side of something terrible happening just outside the range of the microphone. Eventually, human remains believed to belong to Brandon were discovered in the area in 2022. But even after that discovery, many people still argue over the biggest question surrounding the case. What exactly was happening during that call? And why did Brandon sound so terrified? What makes this next 911 call so disturbing is how normal it sounds in the beginning. There's no panic at first, no screaming, no dramatic warning that something terrible is about to happen. Just an elderly woman calmly speaking to a dispatcher from inside her home late at night. And then, within seconds, everything changes. In the early morning hours of January 28, 1990, a woman named Ruth Price called 911 from her home in Pasco County, Florida. Ruth was 72 years old and lived alone. According to reports, she had become concerned after a strange man came to her door asking for someone who didn't live there. The interaction unsettled her enough that she decided to call police. When the dispatcher answered, Ruth sounded nervous but composed. She explained that a man had been outside her home earlier and that something about the encounter didn't feel right. The dispatcher asked her several routine questions. Did the man leave? Was he still outside? Did she know him? Ruth answered calmly. At one point, she even apologized for bothering the police. And that's one of the details people mention most when discussing the call online. She genuinely didn't seem to understand how serious the situation was. To her, this was simply an uncomfortable interaction, something police might check on briefly before the night moved on. But while Ruth was still on the phone with dispatchers, something happened inside the house. There's a sudden noise in the background. Then Ruth gasps. A split second later, she screams. Not the kind of scream people make in movies. It's immediate, raw, completely terrified. The dispatcher instantly begins shouting her name. Ruth! Ruth! But Ruth never responds. The line remains open while dispatch desperately tries to figure out what's happening. Officers were already on the way, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. Investigators later determined that a man had broken into Ruth's home during the call itself. The suspect was eventually identified as a drifter named Michael Esposito. According to reports, he had approached multiple homes in the area that night before targeting Ruth. The case horrified people not just because of the crime itself, but because the entire escalation happened in real time over the phone. Listeners essentially hear the exact moment Ruth realizes someone is inside her home, and then the call abruptly becomes silence and confusion. Over the years, the recording has circulated online in true crime forums and YouTube compilations focused on disturbing emergency calls. Many people consider it one of the most unsettling 911 recordings ever released publicly. Not because it contains graphic audio, but because it feels terrifyingly real. There's no dramatic buildup, no eerie music, no warning, just an ordinary woman speaking calmly to dispatch one moment, and absolute terror the next. What also makes the case especially haunting is how relatable the situation feels. Most people have experienced moments where something felt slightly off. A knock at the door late at night, a stranger asking unusual questions, a feeling that something isn't quite right. But Ruth likely never imagined the danger was already inside her home while she was asking police for help. And that realization is what continues to disturb people decades later. Because when listening to the recording, you know exactly what's about to happen before she does. And there's absolutely nothing anyone can do to stop it. Some emergency calls become disturbing because of what you hear in the background. Others become disturbing because of what the dispatcher doesn't realize until it's already too late. This next case is one of those stories. And even now, people still debate whether the outcome could have been prevented if the situation had been treated more seriously from the beginning. On February 5th, 2012, a social worker arrived at a home in Graham, Washington, to supervise a scheduled visit between a father and his two young sons. The father's name was Josh Powell. For years, Josh had been at the center of growing suspicion surrounding the disappearance of his wife, Susan Powell. Susan had vanished in 2009 under extremely suspicious circumstances. According to Josh, he had taken his two children camping in the middle of the night during a snowstorm while Susan stayed home. When he returned, he claimed she was gone. But investigators quickly became suspicious of his behavior. Friends and family described Susan as a devoted mother who would never willingly abandon her children. And over time, public suspicion surrounding Josh only intensified. By 2012, Josh had lost custody of his sons, and all visits were required to be supervised by social workers. That afternoon, social worker Elizabeth Griffin Hall drove the boys to Josh's house for one of those scheduled visits. At first, everything seemed routine, but the moment the children stepped out of the vehicle and approached the front door, something immediately felt wrong. Josh grabbed the boys and quickly pulled them inside the house. Then he slammed the door shut. Elizabeth ran to the door and tried to follow them inside, but Josh locked her out. At first, she assumed it might be some kind of misunderstanding, but within seconds, panic started setting in. She called 911. The recording has since become infamous online because listeners can hear the frustration and urgency in her voice escalating throughout the call. She repeatedly tells dispatchers that a father with a dangerous history has locked his children inside the home and will not let her enter. But the dispatcher initially treats the situation more like a custody dispute than an active emergency. While Elizabeth pleads for immediate help, precious minutes pass. And then she notices something else, the smell of gasoline. At one point during the call, her voice suddenly changes. The panic becomes real. You can hear the exact moment she realizes something catastrophic may be about to happen inside the house. She begins begging dispatchers to hurry, but before police can arrive, the house explodes. Investigators later discovered that Josh had attacked both boys with a hatchet before deliberately setting the home on fire, killing all three of them. The tragedy shocked the country, not only because of the horrific nature of the crime, but because so many warning signs had existed for years beforehand. The 911 call itself became a major point of controversy afterward. Many people criticized the dispatcher's response, arguing that the danger should have been recognized immediately given Josh's history and the urgency in Elizabeth's voice. Others believe the situation escalated too quickly for anyone to realistically stop it. But regardless of where people stand, the recording remains incredibly difficult to listen to. Because unlike many emergency calls, the horror builds slowly. At first, it almost sounds routine. A social worker trying to explain a strange interaction. A dispatcher asking standard questions. Confusion about what exactly is happening. And then, minute by minute, the reality becomes clear. Something terrible is unfolding behind that locked door. And nobody can reach the children in time. Years later, many people still consider it one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking 911 calls ever made. Because you can hear someone desperately trying to stop a disaster, while realizing they may already be too late. The next case is disturbing because almost nobody understood how serious the situation was at first. What initially sounded like a robbery quickly turned into one of the deadliest unsolved mass shootings in New Mexico history. And even today, nobody knows who was responsible. On the morning of February 10th, 1990, employees began arriving at Las Cruces Bowl, a bowling alley in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Inside the building were several workers, along with children connected to employees who had come in early that morning. At around 8 a.m., 2 armed men entered the bowling alley. According to surviving witnesses, the gunmen forced everyone into a back office area near the front desk. At first, employees reportedly believed they were being robbed, but then the shooting started. Victims were shot execution style at close range. Several of them were children. Despite devastating injuries, multiple people inside somehow survived long enough to call for help. One of the survivors managed to reach a phone and contact emergency dispatchers while seriously wounded. The early calls coming into 911 were chaotic and confusing. Dispatchers struggled to understand exactly what had happened inside the building. Responding officers initially believed there were only a few victims, but once police entered the bowling alley, they realized the scene was far worse than anyone expected. 7 people had been shot. Several were still alive when officers arrived. Police radio traffic from that morning captures responders repeatedly requesting additional ambulances and medical support as they tried to stabilize victims at the scene. The massacre shocked investigators not only because of the violence itself, but because there never appeared to be a clear motive. Very little money was taken from the bowling alley, and the level of brutality seemed far beyond a normal robbery. Over the years, investigators followed hundreds of leads. Some theories suggested organized crime. Others believed the killers may have targeted specific employees. But despite one of the largest investigations in state history, no arrests were ever made. The case remains unsolved more than 3 decades later, and recordings connected to the massacre still circulate online because they capture the terrifying confusion of a real emergency unfolding in real time. You can hear dispatchers trying to piece together incomplete information while officers walk into a scene they clearly weren't prepared for. And that uncertainty is part of what makes the case so unsettling. Because for several minutes that morning, nobody truly understood the scale of what had happened inside that bowling alley. The final story tonight is disturbing for a different reason. There's no masked intruder, no active killer on the other end of the line, no mysterious disappearance. Just a series of ordinary 911 calls from drivers on a highway, trying to warn police that something terrible is about to happen. On July 26, 2009, a woman named Diane Schuler was driving home from a camping trip with her daughter, 3 nieces, and her young son. Family members later described Diane as organized, dependable, and extremely responsible, which made what happened that morning almost impossible for them to understand. At some point during the drive home, Diane began behaving strangely. Relatives later reported receiving phone calls from her, where she sounded confused and disoriented. In one conversation, she allegedly complained that she couldn't see clearly and was having trouble focusing. Not long afterward, multiple drivers on the Taconic State Parkway in New York began calling 911. A minivan was driving the wrong direction directly into oncoming traffic. Witnesses described cars swerving onto shoulders and medians trying to avoid a collision. Several callers sounded confused more than frightened at first. Many assumed the driver was elderly, lost, or unaware they had entered the highway incorrectly. But according to witnesses, the van continued speeding forward for nearly 2 miles without stopping. Then the calls stopped. Moments later, Diane's vehicle crashed head-on into another SUV at high speed. The collision killed 8 people, including Diane, her daughter, and 3 of the children in the van. Investigators later concluded Diane had a blood alcohol level more than twice the legal limit, along with evidence of marijuana use in her system. But almost immediately, the case became deeply controversial. Family members publicly rejected the toxicology findings and insisted Diane would never knowingly drive intoxicated with children in the car. Others believed she may have suffered a hidden medical emergency. Theories spread rapidly online after the release of the documentary There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, which introduced millions of people to the case. To this day, people still debate what actually happened inside that vehicle. But the 911 calls connected to the crash remain especially haunting, not because the audio itself is graphic, but because of how helpless everyone sounds. Drivers are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, calling police, reporting the danger, trying to prevent an accident, and still, nobody can stop what's coming. That's what makes the recording so unsettling. You're listening to ordinary people realize in real time that a catastrophe is seconds away, and by the time anyone fully understands the situation, it's already too late. And that's where tonight's stories come to an end. Some of these recordings became infamous because of panic, others because of how calm everything sounded right before disaster struck. But in every case tonight, the people on those calls had no idea their voices would eventually be heard by millions of strangers years later. If you enjoyed tonight's episode of Dead Air, make sure to subscribe for more true disturbing stories and unsettling real cases. Until next time, good night.